The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, The State of Independent Schools. We'll be getting started shortly, but first I just wanted to go over today's format of the webinar. All phones have been placed on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions in today's webinar, please use the questions tab in the menu to the right. We will address any questions at the end if time permits. Any questions we don't get to will be sent to the presenters to follow up on. We will also be recording this session, and the recording will be sent to all attendees after this session. If you're attending this webinar for CPE credit, you will need to complete all 3 polling questions presented throughout today's webinar. Again, thank you for joining us, and at this point, I would like to turn it over to Marcus Harwood to say a few words.
Hi, thank you. I'm Marcus Harwood, and along with John Toscano, lead Bloom Shapiro's education practice, which includes about 70 independent schools. We're pleased to partner with NBOA today for this presentation as we share their passion for providing value-added information and insights to the industry. We're excited to share some observations about emerging trends based on NBOA's flash survey, COVID-19, financial impact on independent schools, what's working, what's not, as well as ongoing conversations with our clients. It's become clear to us that business officers and leadership teams are an extraordinarily resourceful and dedicated group of people navigating these challenging times. And with that said, I'm happy to introduce our panelists, John Toscano and Jennifer Hillen. John is a partner at Bloom Shapiro and a leader of our education practice. For close to 30 years, John's primary focus has been serving educational institutions of all types and providing specific expertise on endowment, financial reporting, and tax-related matters. Jennifer Hillen joined NBOA early in 2017 and was recently named Chief Learning Officer, overseeing all aspects of NBOA's programming and serving as a content expert on independent school business operations. After several years at the Big Four international accounting firm Ernst & Young, Jennifer spent 8 years as a business officer at Harpeth Hall School in Nashville, Tennessee, an all-girls school with 700 students in grades 5 through 12. Jennifer serves on the teaching faculty for Vanderbilt University's Master of Education in Independent School Leadership program in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations. She's also a member of the board of directors of 2 major nonprofits in Tennessee, Women in Numbers and Renewal House, and wrote and illustrated a book called Good Night, Nashville. So with that, John and Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you all for joining us today in what's the 3rd installment of our Business Officer webinar series. It's been really fun putting these on with my colleagues and the reach we've gained through these in this remote platform. I'm especially thrilled to be joined here today by our guest and my friend Jennifer Hillen from NBOA. Jen, how you holding up these days?
Hanging in there, thanks to friends like you.
Yeah, not too much going on at NBOA, huh?
Yeah, no, we're pretty bored over here.
Yeah, well, I can say definitely in our years of working with and in this industry, I'm pretty sure we both can agree that or at least we thought we've seen everything. Certainly we've seen a lot, multiple downward markets, all kinds of impact, but nothing anything close to what we're seeing this year. And I think I'm so fortunate to have chosen this industry as my area of specialty because, so much is asked of business officers today and in these times especially, and I'm just continually impressed by everyone's resiliency and commitment to the mission. I think your individual and collective responses have really been nothing short of heroic, just in terms of how quickly you've been getting your schools into that position to adapt. So Jen, what are your thoughts as we open up this discussion today?
Well, thanks, John. I couldn't agree more. And first of all, I wanted to start by thanking you and the whole incredible team at Bloom Shapiro for having me today. Leaders like you and your firm joining us and supporting schools through this insanely difficult, unprecedented time who are making the difference. So we are in a challenging time, but the independent school community continues stepping up to showcase its value proposition. And many of you are starting to ask important questions and make critical decisions about what the future of your schools may be. So I love doing programs like this to try to help you get there. The questions we're grappling with most: where do we go from here? What's the next normal? What will we learn from this experience that will inform our practice as educators? What has the disruption taught us about the demands we'll face as the rate of change accelerates daily these days? How must we shift planning to ensure long-term sustainability? So the answers, the few that we have, vary widely. Bullet silver lining. So I'm excited to explore those today because we've been ripe for disruption for a long time. And now that it's here, I'm excited that many of you are making the most of it. So let's dive in.
Thanks. That's great, Jen. So I think what we intend to cover today are what we're seeing and hearing in your world. We've spent the better part of the past 9 months, speaking with business officers really about everything from the initial declaration of the pandemic, subsequent closures, PPP loans, and generally just how everyone is holding up. I personally have had so many discussions with many of you on the line today over the course of the year just to connect and see how you're doing. And you've really taught me a lot about the thought process you've been going through. And for as much as we've learned, I think most significantly how quickly you were able to redirect your efforts to keep the proverbial doors open and at the same time maintaining the safety of the communities. There's still so many uncertainties, and as Jen mentioned, sort of what lies ahead won't necessarily be reflective of what we've seen. Wouldn't you say that, Jen?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that planning in a time of uncertainty like this is nearly impossible, and we're managing so many unknowns. It's really, really challenging. We have found that a lot of our schools do feel like they're in fairly stable financial shape to weather this storm because of the long-standing conservative financial approaches that got them to a stronger point and will hopefully get them through the rest of this time. But we are really concerned about the effects on budget, staffing, and programming, especially as this drags on. The reality of this year's tuition collections is still unknown. Many families are still navigating ongoing or pending uncertainty. There's no telling what enrollment will look like next year. We've got some data about that later on in the program, though. There's loss of auxiliary revenues to contend with. The pandemic is preventing people from safely gathering. So much that we didn't expect. But all of that said, a lot of our schools have weathered the enrollment part of this storm very strongly. That's one of the biggest trends we've seen that is sustaining throughout this year, particularly in areas where private schools have been more nimble than public districts. The pandemic illuminated the reality that families will do almost anything to ensure that their children are safe, educated, and cared for throughout the day by experienced educators. I myself will do almost anything to keep my daughter in school, so I feel for all of these other families. The flash survey we're going to review shortly showed that nearly a quarter of independent schools nationally are fully enrolled with a wait list, and that's incredible. 16% are fully enrolled, so we're talking about more than 40% of the subset in a really strong enrollment position. Over a third are mostly enrolled, and so that's getting us to 3/4 of schools on strong financial footing. The key will be to showcase their value propositions to keep these new families, especially in our folds well after COVID has subsided.
Yeah. And there's really another aspect to that enrollment discussion, which we're going to cover, right? Which is really pretty telling. Yeah.
It really is. Yeah, I'll give you a little preview. Contrasting the enrollment position with what you project your financial results will be is less straightforward than ever. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. One big trend and insight I wanted to applaud business offices for is leaning into the new knowledge that you can be more flexible than you ever imagined. And you rethought longstanding practices to improve business operations. And this happened outside the business office as well, but I would imagine most of our audience might be on that side of the house. So wanted to commend you for rethinking policies and processes once considered unfeasible. You made them a reality within weeks. On the academic side, schools turned around and were doing virtual learning in a matter of days in some cases. But I know that as this wears on, we're really concerned about the emotional and physical well-being of our faculty, staff, families. That's what we're hearing a lot about right now, how to make and keep schools safe and healthy as possible. A really great product of the pandemic, though, has been the value of being more transparent with school communities. I think we've learned how to communicate really well and how to balance certainty with uncertainty how the school makes decisions has really changed, and I think for the better. We'll talk about that a little later. Before, change was really hard to come by, and now it's been forced upon us, and I do think we're making the most of it. Something I found really interesting through this time is that the schools are not made of bricks and mortar. We've spent so much time for decades touting the value of our gorgeous physical plants, and that's not going anywhere. But it's really the relationships with the community that have risen to the top right now. So we'll explore a lot of that and more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think all of that has really brought to light how fluid we really can be in this industry, right? In terms of change. Like you said, I think change used to be so difficult to come by, and it took it was such a process. And not to make light of what everyone's going through today, but that process has been considerably shrunk down to, okay, what are the most important things we got to deal with, and a very high priority list that everyone's sort of knocking down. So we've really seen an evolution in the thinking, and I think the results of the survey we're gonna cover here in a few minutes really highlight this.
Absolutely. It's been interesting. We've done several surveys throughout COVID, which has been great. I'm very mindful of survey fatigue, so I do want to acknowledge that, but I appreciate all of you for continuing to participate, because you really are offering some great insights that we can hopefully return back to you. And it's been interesting to follow what has changed throughout those surveys and what hasn't. So one thing I just thought I'd point out is that compared to the summer, the fall has brought some optimism in terms of projections in enrollment, gross tuition and fees, and financial aid, even though more schools are expecting decreases in enrollment than increases as we go forward. Some are experiencing increases in applications from new families who are reacting to their local public schools plans. Like I said, I can tell you I'm experiencing that firsthand here in Nashville. People are flocking to independent schools. But as we barrel into cold and flu season with COVID spiking, I'm closely watching schools with preschools or early childhood programs, since those seem to take the hardest hit in the spring in terms of declining enrollment and retention, with parents not seeing the value in virtual learning at this young age. Many are still concerned about declining enrollment and tuition revenue throughout this year if families withdraw, if in-person learning can't be a reality, or if COVID impacts the families financially. We have seen the schools noted concerns about enrollment, tuition, and financial aid extending beyond this year. So much uncertainty about the timeline of the pandemic and how long it'll take to turn around. We get some insight, some predictions from you later on, but a lot is yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what's next. The question we've gotten a lot, as before schools are really able to point to the future. I do feel like we've made that really important pivot at this point where we're looking beyond this year, but it's important for this year to inform what's next. And so we were asked a lot, where does our school fit within the continuum of decisions that other independent schools are making about the future and the financial projections they're facing? We are a benchmarking driven industry, which I think is wise. That's prudent business practice, although so hard to say that one set of circumstances at one school fits another. But just to give you an idea, here are some high-level takeaways from the pulse check. And I won't necessarily read the slide to you, but I thought while you read it, I can take the opportunity to share with you some demographics from the respondents of the survey. So just over 30% of responding schools serve fewer than 300 students. A quarter serve 300 to 500, and 20% are 500 to 800, with a quarter of respondents at larger than 800 student schools. This was a little different, though, in New England. I know not all of you, but many of you on the call are in that region. So I wanted to note that 50% of respondents from New England fell in the fewer than 300 students served range. So digging into day and boarding, 80% day respondents, 20% boarding. But again, in the New England group, that was more evenly split, about 50. So we'll offer you some stats for both the national data set and New England. If we have time, we've got some for New York and New Jersey as well. In terms of grades served, 40% of the national data set serve the full pre-K to 12 continuum. 30% are lower school or lower and middle. And then nearly 30% represent middle and upper or just upper school only. Interestingly, but unsurprisingly, New England numbers varied. 40% of respondents in your region represent just upper school, upper grades served. So I hope that gives you an idea of where we're starting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting breakout. Oops, sorry. Let me get back to the right slide here. We are going to have, as Carly mentioned, a polling question, but I think we're a little early. Oh, we are right up onto our first polling question. So Carly, why don't you go ahead and put that up there? Great. Thank you. How is your school tracking in comparison to financial projections prepared? And so please select the best answer and we'll share the results here. Obviously, you know, that's a loaded question, right? There's so many different scenarios out there. So just give us your best crack at this point and be curious to see the results. Keep it open for another 5 seconds or so. Let's see. Polls. Okay. 73% of you have voted, so we'll give it 5 more seconds. How about that? Get that number up there a little bit. All right, Carly, let's close that out and let's share with 80% of you voting. Looks like 30%, closer to best case scenario, 35% of you too early to tell. That's sort of what I figured with the rest of you rounding out to closer to worst case scenario and normal. So it's very, very clear. Thank you, Carly. Take that down. That we really don't know what's happening or what the final obvious results are going to be based on this year's enrollment figures. We have a sense, but again, as we're heading into Thanksgiving break here, which is sort of another reason why we pushed this webinar off a few weeks, was to really gather some more of this data to see what the thought process was of everybody heading into break. I know we have 3 kids that are college age that are getting ready to come home, and we're not really quite sure how we're going to handle that again. But what we do know is we have some results here and some projected fiscal 21 results, which are sort of telling based on what you guys just told us here. So Jen, why don't we walk through some of these things here?
Yeah, and again, I'll point out the optimism that surfaced in that poll, at least.
Yeah.
I understand that a lot of us are unsure, and that will remain the case, but very few respondents seem to align with the worst case scenario. So I'm glad to hear that, not to minimize those of you who fell in that camp, and we want to help you through that time. But I hope that that continues to trend upwards. That's exciting. So you can see on the slide, 52% of all schools, 56% of New England schools do expect a deficit this year, which obviously in normal operating times would not be the case. 30% of all and 38% of New England schools expect to break even. 18% of all, but only 6% of New England schools expect a surplus. So maybe we can dig into that a little bit. I suspect that some of the boarding schools in the mix, having lost international students. 33% of New England schools expect their operating results to be more than 25% lower than last year. I think that's pretty staggering, unsurprising, but a lot to make up for this year. For all schools, the figures are 20% of our respondents think they'll be performing more than 25% lower than last year's results. Half of those fall in the 1 to 25% lower category, which means that more than half think they will be performing pretty poorly compared to last year in terms of more than 25% lower than their operating results.
Yeah, and we foreshadowed this a couple of slides ago where we were talking about the impact of having the enrollment, but what that really translates into this year and this year's scenario with hybrid learning models. And we're going to see how schools started here this year. And we're going to start drilling down into why these results are sort of what they are, at least what we're seeing as we go through the discussion here. But that, you know, reduced tuition revenue combined with other lost revenues, either from the summer or other programs that had to be suspended, combined with increased costs, right, are really going to be the key drivers we talk about here. So what we see here for this year, I think, is pretty glaring on the screen. About 71% of our schools that were surveyed started the year with some sort of hybrid instruction, and, you know, combined with some distance learning and some on campus. I think that's pretty representative of what we've seen within our practice. For the most part, I mean, our practice really covers a wide spectrum of the types of schools that we have on the call today. So, you know, the boarding schools obviously have been able to create their own bubble, and so on-campus learning has been a little bit more of a, I'm not going to say easier, but it has been, they've been able to facilitate that maybe a little bit better by keeping everybody contained, as opposed to some of the day schools where they're on maybe some kind of a rotating block schedule or team schedule, and trying to work and worrying really about what their students are doing when they're not on campus, right, after hours.
Yeah, absolutely. Schools have worked really hard on making changes to their physical plants for those reasons, and the technology within them to allow for as much flexibility as possible when it comes to instruction. It's clearly going to be critical going into the winter season. As of a month ago, 13% of schools nationally have little hope of returning to campus for in-person instruction anytime soon, and I would expect that that number has grown now. This group does include a mix of schools whose campuses will remain closed at least through winter break and/or will remain closed and use distance learning for all students until regular testing, additional PPE, or vaccines are widely available. The latter being absolutely critical. We've seen more fluctuation among schools with varying interest in testing. We'll talk about that a little later. It's the vaccine, really, the widely available and implemented vaccine that we really want. During the NBOA Leadership Academy session yesterday afternoon, some of the faculty and participants noted that their schools are shutting down through mandate or by choice as soon as next week, which is a little earlier than they expected, with no set reopening date in sight. So a lot to keep an eye on there. Nationally, more than 30% started school with all students and faculty on campus, and that was up slightly from our August survey. So I do think the fall was a little more optimistic than at least we expected, not to minimize how hard it's been. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. More than half of the national data set did start with hybrid instruction, so that's fewer than New England, which is interesting. Schools starting in person, are the schools seeing less attrition and in some cases more interest than usual? Again, I will admit that I will do just about anything to have my kid on a school campus, so I follow that camp. Schools are benefiting by being open for in-person instruction and frankly childcare at these younger ages anyway, versus many public schools that were either hybrid or fully virtual to begin the year. But of course, our independent schools offer a lot more than childcare. I mean, that's the world's biggest understatement. Half of all schools and half of New England schools expect to move between fully in-person, hybrid, and fully distance learning, depending on local conditions and guidance from authorities. We noted in a recent NAIS survey that nearly 90% of schools have outdoor tents in place, nearly 20% have leveraged additional building space, and nearly 15% have brought trailers onto campus. So they really are investing. This is New England schools in particular, to create more space to conduct classes. So perhaps schools will be leaning more into that this winter.
So that really begs the question of testing and what's happening out there with respect to testing on campus, right? You had a lot of questions about that, I'm sure.
We have gotten so many questions about that, and schools are falling in all sorts of camps here. On one hand, I'm hearing you can't use testing as a reliable tool since someone could become infected immediately after they're swabbed, or they could test too early, and then you have this false sense of security if you think you're negative, but you're really not. On the other hand, though, and you mentioned this earlier, John, particularly with communities that can be contained, like boarding campuses, we're hearing that testing is invaluable. I do know that a lot of schools utilize testing, both day and boarding campuses, prior to starting the school year. I think that was helpful to root out any positive faculty or students who are asymptomatic, so they're starting from a stronger position. So perhaps that will be a tactic employed after the winter break. Regardless, though, testing is really expensive. Some schools spent well into the 6 or even 7 figures to make it happen. Yeah. That's not sustainable. So they're leaning more into risk mitigation, proper protocol. I have to point out the COVID-19 field guide that NDOA released a couple months ago based on all the science around COVID and how to safely be on campus together. So check that out if you haven't already. And it had responses in there about testing and guidance.
Great stuff. Great stuff. So it's a lot of information. So what we want to try to get from you all here today is a little bit more about what you're doing on your campuses and with your faculty and staff. So Carly, maybe put the next polling question up. How often is your school testing faculty and staff for COVID-19? And you can start the answer process now. So much, and Jen, you're so right. I mean, that cost of continuing that testing on a regular basis that some of our clients are conducting is just absolutely not sustainable for the better part of the community. But you know, so I do think we'll talk a little bit about this later in the governance section about how risk management has also evolved. That's you know, into something that's beyond what we're traditionally used to. So we have 74% of the vote in here. Let's give it, maybe we're all voted out at this point, huh? I probably shouldn't go down that road, but there will be no recounts here today. 5 seconds, and then we'll close it out and share the results. 2, 1. Here we go. Oop. Well, I can tell you that, oh, there we go. So 29% are testing weekly, with the balance of you doing some other rotation or timing, which is interesting. So it'd be great if some of you wouldn't mind sharing that in our chat feature. It'd be great to hear sort of what you guys are doing out there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly.
And those of you doing weekly, where are those resources coming from? I'm fascinated. That's a really strong investment, though, for your school communities, and probably a reason you're able to have everyone comfortable coming back. So good for you.
Okay.
So we talk about enrollment.
Enrollment in the bottom line. I think what we're all waiting to hear about, right?
Enrollment typically is the bottom line. So
yeah.
That's why we put this here. So I mentioned earlier, the good news is that enrollment declines projected earlier on in the pandemic have not materialized overall. Only 15% of New England schools indicated that you're under-enrolled. What's really interesting, though, we gave a little teaser about this earlier, is to contextualize this fairly strong enrollment standing with the more mixed projections of FY21 financial results. In any other normal year, if a school was well enrolled, their financial results were nearly certain. However, in COVID times, they're anything but. One head of school I talked to recently said he had never spent so much money and not built a building, not had a huge, gorgeous physical space on his campus to show for it, just to put perspective around the money schools are spending on unexpected COVID expenses. Nationally, a quarter of the data set indicated that they're under-enrolled this year, so New England is outperforming that. But more than 50% of those are anticipating a deficit, whereas 40% of schools report being fully enrolled, including many of which have a wait list. Only half of those respondents are now anticipating a surplus. So all these extra COVID expenses are just eating up the strong enrollment. In any other year, the enrollment would be a nearly foolproof barometer to predict financial results, and now we're completely disrupted. So it's pretty stressful. John, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, clearly one of the main drivers here is the consideration that everyone has had to give to discounting tuition under this hybrid model, right, or distance learning model. And, you know, a lot of our schools have had students that were not able to return to campus for a number of reasons. Either they're in an at-risk environment, which is one case, or you know, a certain subset of their international students are still overseas and not returning. And in limited cases have I seen, you know, those tuitions not necessarily be discounted, right, to some sort of lower fee. But I think that it's a double-edged sword, as while the families are getting, you know, the benefit of a discount. I think what some people don't understand, I think, is the cost of remote learning isn't necessarily any cheaper, right, or less expensive for the institution, and in most cases is probably going to result in more costs, especially as you're ramping it back up. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I thought that it was appropriate to sort of comment on that here. So I think, you know, even though enrollment status, you know, is definitely one of the more important indicators for financial success that we're heading into here for fiscal 21, I think those additional expenses can't be overlooked, like supplies and equipment, technology, and so forth. That it really is going to have a tremendous it's going to tremendously stress our financial budgets this year.
Yeah,
and heading into next year.
Oh, absolutely, and potentially beyond, although I hope not. We'll remain optimistic. What's been really interesting throughout this time is how much the misperceptions of the independent school business model have been illuminated by the pandemic. Misunderstanding about what it means not to be on campus. You mentioned distance learning can cost even more. I think it's provided an opportunity for a lot of schools to clearly communicate with their communities about their business model. It's a delicate dance, but some have done it really well. So I hope that continues to be the case.
Yeah. And I hope the intangible cost, right, that doesn't show up in a number necessarily directly isn't something that we can control as a community, right? Because being at an independent school is being part of a community. And how do you keep everybody connected if they're not present necessarily, or if you're disconnected from the rest of your group, so to speak. So certainly something to keep in mind. I think the next couple of slides here are from our friends at the Enrollment Management Association, who also did a survey on enrollment trends. So really interesting results here. Jen, maybe we just spend a minute talking about each one of these slides. We have a lot of information to get to here.
Yes, we do. We can go pretty quickly through this, but NBOA is in year 3 of a partnership with our friends at EMA to explore the disrupted business model. And now it feels a little funny to say we were disrupted before COVID, since no one could have predicted a disruption like this. So they being EMA, wanted to survey their schools because they were hearing a lot of rumblings that even though enrollment was stronger than anyone could have predicted for all the reasons we've already said, they weren't seeing that same success with early indicators in the admission cycle for this year. So fall is a really important time with applications coming in and interest and inquiries, and that was down. So they just wanted to do a quick survey. These are preliminary results, and they do validate the initial rumblings. So you can see on this slide that there are some schools reporting a significantly better pool than last year, but plenty are falling in that worse to significantly worse. On the next slide, on this slide, these stats are pretty staggering in terms of how COVID has rocked the boat with market influx. Unsurprisingly, only a small number of schools are seeing international student interest increase, but more than a quarter are seeing interest increase from domestic students, period. And a staggering 80% of schools are experiencing an influx from public schools. We always knew those families were out there, especially full-pay families. Now the trick will be to retain them after COVID. And what's tricky about that is certainly independent schools are showing a very strong value proposition right now, but they're also not able to fully showcase their full value propositions. Maybe they have an international travel component that's really key. They do a lot with extracurricular activities, athletics, dance, you name it. Those are the things that are really on hold. So I hope that those families who are coming, maybe potentially out of desperation from the public sector, still really feel what the independent school value proposition is. I think they will. I think once you're in an independent school, it's nearly impossible to go back. But I hope that
we definitely have clients that have been impacted positively by that exodus, so to speak. So, and I know several of my partners have shared that information with me over the past few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly on this last slide to correlate with the one before it, we're seeing that more than 40% of schools are reporting a loss of international students. I do think that's temporary. I think when the pandemic is subsiding or over, they'll be back. Nearly 40% have families experiencing financial hardship from COVID, or up to 2/3 at least experiencing some sort of uncertainty from the pandemic. So more to come from our friends at EMA.
Definitely. So we're up against our third polling question here. Carly, if you want to put that up on the screen, we'll get that underway quickly here. Which response best describes your school's current enrollment? fully enrolled with a wait list, fully enrolled, mostly enrolled, some open seats, under enrolled. The responses are coming in fast and furiously here. Already up to 70, almost 3/4 of the population here has voted. Let's leave this open for 5 more seconds so that we can move along. And there we go. Carly, let's share the responses here. Interesting. Wow, so 1/3 of you are fully enrolled with a wait list. Fully enrolled, about 12% of you. You can see the results there. Almost 40% of you are mostly enrolled. So generally positive results, 20% under enrolled, and hopefully taking measures there to mitigate that. I know that those are some of the business officers we've spoken to over the last several weeks that have had a lot of concerns and a lot of sleepless nights. So hopefully, again, you can find some comfort in your community here and pave the way. We're going to move forward here to thank you, Carly. You can take that down. I think, some of the reasons I think that we're going to see here for, again, the earlier slide with the fiscal, results looking the way they do, here we go, are in this checklist here, results where the poll asked the participants to sort of rank what the biggest additional expense or lost revenue line item really is here. And I can't say that there's any surprise here from what I saw in the top 3 or 4 items, at least from my personal dealings with folks. I think discounted tuition continues, as we mentioned throughout the last couple of slides. We'll also see some concerns over collectability of tuition this year. We thought we were going to see more of it, I think, heading into the end of fiscal 20. I don't want to speak for everybody else in our practice, but I didn't see as much of that as I expected. Mostly, I think, probably because of the timing of when things happened. But, I think it's a top of mind concern for folks this year. Testing, obviously, has been running into the tens of thousands of dollars, and depending on how frequently you go. I've heard of some schools up in the 7-figure range, high 7-figure range. So really staggering numbers. So I think those I've spoken with definitely cited the combination of those reduced revenues, added staffing, especially in the areas of temporary or substitute teachers, cleaning, and health center staffing, is really having that that it's causing stress on definitely their budgets. Geographically here in New England, how do we compare, you think, Jen, to the rest of the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I noted that there were some differences between the nation overall and New England. I think all schools are experiencing most, if not all, of these issues. So we could be splitting hairs in saying that. But for the overall data set, hiring additional staff was the area projected to consume the greatest additional expense, followed by increased expense from remote delivery of instruction, and then refunds of tuition or uncollectible tuition. What's not on the slide that I wanted to point out is that we asked respondents what percentage of their operating budget is related to COVID expenses that they wouldn't normally incur. Nearly 1/3 of schools projected spending 5 to 10% of their operating budget this year here alone, and another 15% project spending even more than that. So you hear that, you think, well, that's not bad, but even on just a $10 million budget, I know many of our schools are larger than that, that could be very significant resources going to pandemic expenses that need to be covered by a lot of full-paying students. And I'll remind everyone, not to be doomsdayer here, but most of our schools didn't charge what it costs to educate in non-pandemic times already. We like to joke that everyone's on financial aid unless you charge what it costs. So we're just really feeling those pressures and tensions come to a head here.
Yeah, and I think this next slide sort of tells us a little bit about what we're seeing with respect to some of those staffing considerations, right? And so kind of what's curious that floated to the top is, I think, from a full-time faculty and staff FTE perspective, we can see the numbers there, just under half, just over half, expect to be flat or are flat based on their projections this year. Again, I've talked to a lot of different business officers over the last several weeks, and that's something that I've actually heard rather regularly, was that there were no significant staffing changes heading into this year, which I was a little surprised at, to be perfectly honest. But I think, some of the reasons they gave made a lot of sense. I think there were some natural attrition of people that happened on its own. Maybe those positions were left open, and so that allowed them to sort of backfill the budget with some promises that were made with respect to compensation levels, benefit levels, and so forth. So interesting discussion points, and it was interesting to hear that from the folks I spoke with.
Yeah, it is. And so I'll be the first to say that our staffing model needs a major look. But I will also be the first to say that our people are what make our schools and deliver our mission. So I know that our independent schools, even when this started at the beginning of the calendar year, said we have to take care of our faculty and staff through this time. And if we take care of them, then they'll take care of our students and our families. So I do think the schools that leaned into some of those other sort of natural opportunities to make shifts are the ones who have found success in shifting their compensation expenses. There were several schools who, if they didn't want to eliminate positions, understandably, found that the best way to retain most of their employees was to freeze or even reduce pay, which is not an ideal business practice, and come back to wanting to take care of your people. Not great in the long run, but it did mean that they were able to retain more faculty. And I got some interesting insights from our Business Officers Council earlier this week that many schools that had previously done that, either frozen or reduced pay, and in most cases, I think it was just frozen. They're confident in the school's ability to make up for those reductions in pay, some as early as January. So I hope that optimism holds going into budgeting and planning for next year.
Yeah, for sure. Next couple of slides, I think there's some budget items that really jump off the page at us, and Jen, let's walk through these really quickly here.
Yeah, so these are some of the biggest areas of impact on our budgets and how they're faring in this environment. So I just mentioned people are who deliver our mission and are impacted by it. People are also where all of our money goes. So first, with the students we serve, you can see the national stats on the slide. So I'll add that in New England, the results are fairly on par with these. 44% expect aid to be up to 10% higher than last year. 15% expect it to be even higher than that.
Yeah, I've heard a sort of some mixed results here from folks that I've been talking to, in that, with the coupled, and I hate to bring this up again, but it's our reality, right? Coupled with reduced gross tuition, the increase in financial aid requests, right, are really creating that pressure on the budget, and on our projections. Many schools have been able to control that gap and narrow it, so to speak, with a variety of things. I think some schools that were fortunate to have, generous benefactors and donors who maybe funded a temporary COVID relief fund to help pay for some of that extra financial aid. Others maybe built that from the tuition credits that were donated back to the schools, so to speak. So, and then there's others that it's the harsh reality that we're seeing here is that there is a big gap here. So, unfortunately,
there is. I do hope that anyone listening in or watching this later is handling these new COVID aid requests differently than the normal financial aid process. Segregate those funds, talk about it very differently, then you're more likely to ensure that it's temporary. So that's something we're seeing play out in different ways.
Yep.
On this side, like we said, we are a people business, so it's critical to look at what's happening with staffing. We talked about some of these details a couple of slides back, so I'll use this as an opportunity to implore our entire industry to see that this is the time to reinvent our traditional model. Health and safety concerns and the lack of proper working space at home are issues today. We're contemplating that as we're returning to school, leaving school, possible redistribution of space and people will present new issues and obstacles as we address personal accommodations and physical distancing requirements. Changes in the delivery of both the academic and co-curricular programs may also change our requirements, and you can think really creatively about redeploying those people or not filling positions. We've got to balance our employee skills with the new needs of our programs while mindful of the need to use layoffs as a last resort. We'll talk more about it later on, but if nothing else, start by re-examining class size. Small class sizes and beautiful campuses are two of the things the pandemic has challenged the most. And we've uncovered so many more layers to our value propositions beneath those during this time. Let's lean into that.
Yeah. And no discussion really would be complete without talking, or at least a little bit, about the impact of our endowments, and whether or not those decisions about drawing from those reserves are going to be impacted by what we're seeing this year. What are you hearing out there, Jen, about that?
A mixed bag, a lot of uncertainty. Financial and business planning in this time is compelling. The uncertainty impacts financial planning, reporting, risk management, how we're deploying facilities, financial assistance, all of that. Traditional business modeling and financial planning, including the reserves you may have in place for rainy days, is based on the assumption that we're at an increased risk of being materially invalid, particularly in times of fast and unpredictable change. We know that the availability of funds to invest in change and future operations will depend heavily on the length of the recovery time, the impact of each of our parents and donors, and the decisions we've made leading into this time, like what value and investment we placed in reserves. Many schools didn't have liquid or unrestricted funds to tap going into this crisis, but this will be one of the top learnings from the pandemic that I hope we'll consider in better preparing for the next disruption. Unsurprisingly, schools that are fortunate enough to have reserves are using them, some in moderation given the uncertainty ahead. This is a good time, though, to your point, John, to bring up the common misperceptions around endowments that very publicly played out earlier in the pandemic. When we talk about cash reserves on this slide, I'm not talking about endowments. I'm talking about true unrestricted reserves. But when we were going through, for example, the PPP process in the spring, with families expecting refunds and urging the school to use their endowment instead. Having an endowment must mean you're a wealthy school, and certainly having an endowment is better than not having an endowment. But the pandemic has illuminated for many the differences between board designated versus true endowments, provided an opportunity to appeal to donors in new ways, because only a donor can restrict the dollar. Although we tend to consider the liquid net assets that the board may set aside from prior surpluses or something like that for specific projects or even reserves, we tend to call those quasi-endowment. Maybe we don't even use the word quasi, we just dump them into our endowment, but they're really not. The board does have the authority to redesignate those funds at any time.
Right.
Can't redesignate what donors have given, and that's got to be in place to ensure intergenerational equity. So cash reserves are so important in terms of flexibility on the other side. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think, and interestingly enough, if you look in the rearview mirror at the accounting standard change that happened last year with all nonprofits and schools especially, and we added this liquidity footnote in the financial statements, which almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost like it almost foretold that we needed to really focus on this aspect, right? And so I'm curious to see if people look back at that note. I know we were very diligent in making sure we pointed out things like, the board can redesignate, monies out of board designated funds. But at the end of the day, what that bottom line liquidity number looked like for a 12-month period of time, I think was really critical to know heading into it. And hopefully that was a helpful tool to some extent. And I'd be curious to see if we did a look back on that, how that would all stack up,
Yeah.
But not to turn this into a financial statement discussion, because we only have 10 minutes left. Boy, I'll tell you, time flies. So let's go through two more budget items.
Yeah, we'll go really quickly here. I'm assuming we will maybe share a PDF of our slides with the audience. So
yeah.
I'll just point out that it was really staggering to see the contrast, in the first bullet and the sub bullet beneath it. that we're increasing our gross tuition collection and yet seeing the declining operating results for every year. We've already talked a lot about that. The last bullet is encouraging, though, in terms of philanthropic support schools are garnering through this time. So I think in the interest of time, we could probably move on to this slide. Wanted to just point out that at 9 out of 10 schools, the following has already happened or is in process. And again, I won't read this slide to you, but these were all done to support students, faculty, and staff during COVID, to enable virtual learning, to reduce class size for physical distancing, to allow for physical distancing in other ways. So on the next slide, what's important to point out is that many schools are moving more slowly in the reevaluation of their strategic plans. So we made all these difficult but important operational decisions pretty quickly. We've got to now move beyond the operational to the strategic. This slide and the last one felt really powerful to us, though, because all of our schools have accomplished so much in such a short time. So it means that we have such potential to continue to adapt and evolve more efficiently in the future.
So as far as, the impact that governance and leadership, and the impact this has had on governance and leadership, and whether this has really, how engaged have folks been, I think these are, very positive, I'd say beyond positive responses here, where 92% of the respondents in the survey agreed or strongly agreed that the trustees understand the financial challenges and that the school's being governed at the appropriate strategic level. Now, I know we all have had experiences, challenging experiences working with some of the members of our trustees, where maybe they are diving in a little deep, right? But in some cases, maybe that makes a little bit of sense. But as long as they maintain the right strategic focus, and it sounds like they are, I think that's a home run for everybody. We've seen noticeable increase in involvement by the trustees at this particular level. Not to make it sound like they were disengaged. I think just the type of involvement, more frequent and engaging strategic and risk decisions and discussions, I think are really becoming more apparent here. And in some cases, we've even seen discussions where they've entertained the idea of combinations with other institutions in worst case scenario planning, which is really a paradigm shift if you think about it, right? Because never in a million years, I think, was that really a topic of consideration, at least not seriously, from my personal experience. So we're seeing that shift for sure. Majority of the respondents also agree or strongly disagree that senior administrators are responding appropriately. Well, we've gone on and on about how great you guys have been, and clearly, your heads and other team members have come together in the form of task forces and really approach this strategically and from a team perspective. So, but it is concerning the toll on everyone's mental health, I think, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So, any other comments, Jen, from your observations there?
Well, I totally agree with what you said, and I think for the most part, boards have been functioning at the right level, and maybe even functioning better than they were before, because the pandemic accelerated this strong but important delineations between governance and management. And there's this new funnel that's opened up, to your point about paradigm shift, the strategic decision making that would have happened much more slowly pre-COVID. So it's been interesting. I will implore all of you to buy this book, Effective Financial Governance, School Trustees, because the board's fiduciary role is what's most critical during a time like this. And I think they've been successful.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay. So what's next? What's next for our folks here? I think this is what everybody's been waiting for. All your answers, right?
We wait 55 minutes and here we are. It's hard to know where we'll end up from here, but I'm optimistic that it'll be a much better place than where we began if we leverage the ideas and the opportunities that are coming to the fore. So in terms of ideas and opportunities, leveraging technology in all aspects of what we do in finance and operations is essential. More and more functions need to become automated and paperless to reduce the reliance on in-person. The use of our facilities can and should be totally reimagined. We've talked about that already. The likelihood sustained need for support presents opportunities to engage with donors and build supportive relationships with our families who are facing this greater need. Remote learning can have a positive impact on the traditional revenue model. Online learning can be made available to a broader student base. We're hearing some interesting things about that, providing the opportunity to monetize the delivery to other students not currently enrolled, or enabling us to continue to reach a broader community, our different boarding communities, should they not be able to return, and so on. We said that overnight, essentially, independent schools suddenly had this fully trained workforce on, virtual learning, distance learning. We can do a lot more with that. In terms of solutions, financial modeling and budgeting in this time of changing environments highlighted the need for agile business systems. So schools would benefit from an enterprise resource planning solution where you're connecting all your key functions in an independent school: HR, finance, admissions, advancement, student management, etc. And then you would utilize KPIs to manage the business in real time. We spend a lot of time talking about data. I mentioned on an earlier slide that this is the time to reinvent our traditional staffing model, to that first bullet, both in terms of faculty and administration. Rather than planning to go back to the status quo, we should examine how this new digital platform is being used and how it can be improved. There is talk of what's happening in unionized environments. We don't have to spend a ton of time on that, but we do have a new program on demand about that if anyone's dealing with that at your schools. In cases where a school might have faculty members not on board, we talked about being a little strategic with attrition. That could be the impetus needed to make some difficult decisions. This is also an opportunity just operationally to review and update all of your contracts, employment, admission, and others, to incorporate a version of the current pandemic notice and pandemic waivers as standard clauses, and think about what this next sustained disruption could look like. Closer collaboration between support operations staff and academic faculty can produce new learning strategies and professional learning for all. It's a time to really leverage all of our skills and the collective, to find a collective benefit in a new model of teaching and learning.
Yeah.
An area of focus for HR should definitely be the development of a hybrid staffing model. I think that the schools that have leaned into that are able to be much more nimble and agile as we move through the pandemic, but it would be interesting to take that beyond this time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with each of those ideas, opportunities, solutions, there are risks which need to be addressed, right? And so I know us, for one, have seen a significant uptick in requests for overall enterprise reviews, right? Where we're looking at staffing models. Is it appropriate? Is it, are there any holes? Internal control reviews. Obviously cyber risk is a continuing problem. And even as you mentioned with the HR thing and policies that you have in place, is there an appropriate remote work policy in place now that we've entered into this new phase? And so our HR folks are really busy on the trail, advising on those areas as well. So certainly don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any assistance there. I think with that, our last polling question. Carly, want to just throw that up there for our group before we lose everyone heading into lunchtime?
While they're doing the polling question, you inspired a thought in me, John, which is that I do think schools are going to be much more bold than they have been before, and things that were really taboo and off the table before, like, what would be hush-hush considering a merger, an acquisition, or something like that, is much more strategic. And we're running businesses here, and we're not forgetting our mission at the end of the day. But I think that the schools that are willing to innovate and reach out and maybe have conversations like that are the ones that are going to stick around and be really strong after this. So I'll be curious.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Carly, don't worry about the polling question. I think we're all pulled out anyway at this point. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, Jen, for joining me today. It's one of my great pleasures to always, present with you, and I'm glad we were able to make this happen again. And I thank you, NBOA, for all of your support and guidance. And thank you all for everything you're doing out there. Stay safe. Please enjoy the holidays to the best you can. And, we'll see you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. Stay healthy, everyone. We're here for you.